27th, we were expecting images from the major observatories, and we got them, clean, smooth, and correct. So correct that those who handle the raw materials immediately came up with one word: polished, because real space looks dirtier. There's jitter, pixels, noise, cosmic rays, microshifts, strange needles on bright spots. But here, everything seemed to have been filtered through a sieve that only retains what's convenient to show. And on exactly that same day, an amateur, without grants or a press service, took a shot that no one asked for. He simply set the camera to track, as he had done hundreds of times. And suddenly, something appeared in the series that wasn't in the official data. Not a plate, not a ball of light, not Hollywood, but a short, cold geometric trace that doesn't resemble dust, or a jet, or a matrix defect. A trace that looks like part of the structure. The worst part is, it could be chalked up to a camera artifact. A shaking, a plane, a satellite, anything. And so the story could have died in 5 minutes, if not for one detail. 42 minutes later, another person, in another country, with a different lens and a different camera, gets almost the same fragment. Not similar in mood, but identical in form and timing, as if they were filming the same experiment from two ends of the world. Neither knew the other. Neither was looking for sensation. One photographed out of habit, the other for an astronomy class in a city where the sky is rarely revealed in winter, and therefore every window is treasured. Let's call the first one Ilya. He has the usual setup: editing, tracking, DSLR, short bursts to be put together later. He doesn't believe, he counts. His folders are labeled dryly, without emotion. The second is Mario. He lives further south, so he has a different sky and a different atmosphere. He prefers raw footage to beautiful composites, because raw footage reveals life, while composites often reveal only the editing process. They both captured the same moment. In one frame, 3-eye atlas shows a familiar pattern: a core, a faint tail, a slight asymmetry. In the next, there's a flash of structure, as if a window had opened on the object for a split second. Not light in the conventional sense, more like a sharp shift in reflection, like a metal facet that's turned toward the sun at just the right angle, or like a flat element that momentarily becomes a mirror. In Ilya's frame, it looked like a thin rectangular bracket next to the core. It wasn't a line from the satellite's track, as it wasn't extended along the satellite's motion, but sat nearby, attached to the object. In the shot, Mario had a similar bracket, but from the other side, as if they were looking at different angles and seeing different sides of the same thing. The combined effect was worse than any clear picture, because a clear picture gives you a chance to say fake, but two slanted, independent frames give you a chance to say reality, which doesn't have to be convenient. Ilya first did what normal people do. He scolded himself for his poor control, restarted the sequence, checked the white balance, changed the memory card, and took calibration shots. The error was bound to happen again, if it was an error. It didn't repeat itself. This fragment was unique, but it was too smooth to be random. Matrix defects usually repeat. Cosmic rays are usually finer and more chaotic. And here there was form. Mario, unaware of it, wrote in the local chat, "I've got a weird frame near the core. Anyone else see it?" and was met with silence. Not because no one wanted to hear it, because everyone's observation windows were different. He uploaded the raw footage, unprocessed. And at that moment, the story ceased to be someone's fantasy, because the raw files have captions, metadata, and sequence. They smell of truth, even if the truth is unpleasant. Then came the first attempt at a smooth explanation. One of the experienced participants wrote, "It looks like an airplane in a short exposure, but the airplane isn't sitting next to the core at 2 points in the world in the same window." Another said, "A satellite. But a satellite doesn't create a rectangle tied to the comet's motion. And most importantly, a satellite would have a uniform track pattern, whereas here there was no track. Here there was a shape." The third said what they always say at such moments: check the time. And checking the time became the crux of the matter. The difference between Ilya's and Mario's shots matched the predicted flight geometry and one strange gap in the telemetry that had already been flickering in the gray archive. That same dip, officially called channel interference, which too often coincided with the object taking another step in its activity. Once this was realized, the second stage began. The most unpleasant. Letters and messages without direct threats, but with the right tone. Don't publish raw data until verified. Don't make a fuss. This could be dangerous for your reputation. The word reputation sounds funny when talking about an object that seems to behave like an instrument. But at that moment, everyone remembered that major observatories show the world not raw footage, but pre-selected images. Smooth shots where the unintended is removed, the harsh is softened, and the dubious is deleted. Photos that are perfect for news reporting, but bad for investigative reporting. Ilya looked through the same window to see the official publications. The same patch of sky was there. The same object was there, and there was nothing out of place. No brackets, no windows, no hint of geometry. This didn't prove a fake. But it did prove a filter, because if an amateur has a brief phenomenon in the raw material, professionals are bound to have it at least as noise. But there wasn't even a hint of it. And then Ilya did something amateurs don't usually do. He compared not the image itself, but the frame statistics. Histograms, peaks, noise distribution, short brightness jumps in one area of the frame, and he saw something strange. At the moment of the bracket, his signal increased not only in the visible spectrum. The nature of the noise changed slightly, as if active interference appeared near the object for a split second. It's like when a radio transmitter is turned on near a camera, and the sensor responds. But nothing was turned on near him. He was alone, on the roof, in the cold air, where you can hear the metal singing. Mario was checking something else at the time. He was looking to see if a similar phenomenon had occurred on previous nights, and he found a frame from 3 days earlier. Not as obvious, but similar in concept. It's as if the object sometimes reveals itself for a moment when the angle is just right. It's as if there's an element that isn't always illuminated, but reflects only at a precise position, like a lighthouse without a lamp. And then a question arose that made me feel uneasy. If this is a reflection from an edge, then the object has an edge. If an object has an edge, then its surface is not chaotic, but structured. Comets don't have to be smooth, but they do have to be unintelligent in their signal shape. Random clumps produce random highlights. And here was a rectangle, a shape too human-like for space. Ilya wrote to Mario directly. 2 messages, no emotion, just the facts. Time, coordinates, shutter speed, ISO, focus, burst. Mario replied just as dryly. And the dryness was the worst part, because dryness doesn't sell myths. Dryness fixes them. They compared the frames, and they saw a third detail that was groundbreaking. The bracket appeared neither at the beginning nor at the end of both sequences. Rather, it appeared roughly in the middle, at the same interval relative to the estimated moment of best visibility. As if this weren't a fluke of their cameras. As if it were a window that opens on a schedule. Briefly, precisely, enough to see, but not enough to believe. And then the gray archive made its presence felt again, because at that very moment, one of the major data streams, usually available in near real time, suddenly released a delayed update. It didn't switch off, it just went silent, and then produced a smooth picture later. It seems like a small thing, but if you know what to look for, you see a pattern. First, a window, then silence, then a beautiful result. Ilya said something that many would later repeat, but it was the first time he'd heard it. The question isn't what it was. The question is, why don't they have it? Because if a major observatory doesn't have it, it means they've either lost it or they've deleted it, and both options are bad. That same evening, a third party, without introducing themselves, asked Mario for the source code, politely, with the right words, and with a request not to make it publicly available. Mario asked, "Who are you?" They answered evasively, the group helping with the verification, and they added one detail that made his hands go cold. "We know your city and your observation point. It's not magic, it's just people who can read the sky and metadata." But at that moment, it became clear that the story had gone beyond a hobby. Ilya proposed a simple solution that always works against pressure: duplication. He sent copies of the raw data to several people in different countries, not to leak it, but to protect the data. An hour later, one of the recipients wrote briefly, "I have a third match." And now this wasn't a dispute about artifacts. The third coincidence turns the story into a problem, because a problem requires a response. And a response is what the object seems to be able to read. And while major observatories continued to publish smooth images, a new layer of reality was emerging in amateur chat rooms. Jagged, noisy, but alive. There was something there that couldn't be missed. And the most disturbing thing was that the bracket wasn't the only thing. In one of the frames at the very edge, a second element flickered. A thin line that didn't stretch, but stood like an edge. And if it's an edge, then it's not a highlight, it's a shape. At the same time that the bracket surfaced among amateurs, the official films looked sterile, not a little cleaner, but as if the very possibility of surprise had been subtracted from the frame. And this isn't frightening because of the mysticism. It's frightening because of how easy it is to do. Large observatories almost never show what the instrument's eyes see. First, the frame goes through a conveyor belt. Dark subtraction, flat fields, masks, cosmic ray filtering, flare rejection, and recombining the series. These procedures are necessary. Without them, scientific images turn into mud. But they have a side effect. The algorithm tends to consider anything that appears in just 1 or 2 frames and isn't repeated exactly the same as garbage, especially if it resembles straight geometry. Straight lines and angles in astrophotography almost always indicate satellites, airplanes, interference, and reflections. The conveyor belt has learned to hate such things over the years. Ilya understood this, so he took another step, the one that distinguishes "I want to believe" from "I want to verify." He took his raw image and ran it through a standard set of beauty procedures. The staple disappeared, It didn't loosen, it didn't thin, it vanished completely, as if it had never been there. And in that moment, everything fell into place so clearly that it became unpleasant even to breathe. The result is a simple picture. An amateur sees what the camera sees. A professional publishes what has survived the filters. And if a bracket lasts only one frame, the filter swallows it as a mistake. But then a second question arises, worse than the first. If it really is part of the object, why does it only last for one frame? Why doesn't it persist for minutes, like a tail or a stream? The answer may be quite simple. It's not light. It's a reflection, and a reflection doesn't have to last long. It only takes a second for the facet to be at just the right angle to the sun and earth. And this is where amateurs suddenly gain an advantage. Large telescopes often shoot in different modes. Longer shutter speeds, different filters, different frequencies, a different plot, a different compromise. An amateur uses short bursts because their control is simpler and they're wary of blurring. And short bursts capture the moments that are later eliminated during the stacking process. Mario also uncovered another detail that's rarely considered by those who look at publications. A publication doesn't have to be from the same window. It can be from the same day. They found an official photograph dated the same day and compared it with the ephemeris. The data indicated that the photograph was taken either before the window or after, at a more convenient time for quality. That is, they officially showed the object, but they might not have shown the exact hour. The hour when it was most visible and when the geometry of the object first surfaced in the minds of amateur observers. It looks like an honest trick. It's like they weren't hiding anything. They simply chose a shot where everything was normal. And normality becomes a suspicious category these days. The third coincidence reported by the person in the chat turned out to be the most disturbing. He didn't see the bracket as clearly, but his source did have a short step of brightness near the core. Not a stripe, not a dot. It's a step, as if part of something blocked the light and then let it back in. It's not a reflection anymore. It's more like an obstruction or a shadow. A shadow in space sounds funny until you remember that a shadow appears where there is form, an edge, geometry, and that a shadow always requires a light source and a body to block it. When they time-stamped the shots, they created a sense of mechanics. First, the edge flashes. Then, a few seconds later, a step appears. Then, everything disappears. And at this point, something that always ruins the piece more than any anomaly entered history. A letter with an official tone. It arrived in Ilya's email, which he hadn't disclosed publicly. It wasn't a threat, not an order. It was a polite request to provide materials for verification and a request to refrain from dissemination. There was no logo, just the signature coordination group, and the phrase usually written by those accustomed to being listened to. This is important for correct interpretation. Ilya responded with a single line. Name the organization and the person responsible. Silence followed. Then a second contact through a different channel with the same request, but more gently. The strongest pressure always comes across as concern. We just don't want to panic. Don't fuel your imagination. Wait until the specialists check. If it had been an ordinary comet, the matter would have been settled. But they already had 3 independent sets of data, and all pointed to the same thing. The phenomenon was brief, geometric, and tied to an object. So they did what anyone does to avoid becoming a point of failure. They distributed the data, not publicly, but to a trusted network of people who know how to read raw footage. What was important wasn't the hype, but the survival of the fact. So that tomorrow, it wouldn't be possible to say, nothing happened. You lost everything. A fourth fragment appeared overnight, not from an amateur camera, but from a small university observatory that sometimes provides raw materials for students to practice on. It was less visible there because of the different filter, but there was a brightness spike in the same area, and it coincided with the amateur's window within minutes. Now it's become too big to be attributed to a defect in one camera model. It's too widespread to be mitigated with a single call. And it was at that moment that everyone started experiencing simultaneous glitches. Someone's access to the archive was lost. Someone's catalog stopped loading. Someone else's group publishing rules were suddenly updated. No one said outright, you can't. It's just that the world around data has become sticky and slow, as if someone is stalling for time to decide what constitutes reality. Mario noticed something else odd. His post in the local chat disappeared from search results. It wasn't deleted. It was visible via the link, but it didn't appear in the general feed. This isn't magic or a conspiracy. It's precisely the kind of invisible friction they create when they want an event to fizzle out on its own. And then Ilya did something usually reserved for professionals. He put together a short verification package. Raw materials, calibration, parameters, coordinates, precise time, and alignment method. And I sent it not to the press, but to several independent scientific outlets where people know how to verify without hysteria. The idea was simple. Let those who aren't interested in a pretty picture see it. The answer came faster than he expected, and it was dry. The phenomenon is present. Doesn't look like a cosmic ray. doesn't look like a satellite. A comparison with professional sources is required. This last phrase was the key one, because professional raw materials always exist. It can't not exist. The only question is access and who decides what the world sees. That same day, another coincidence emerged. The official observing window at a major observatory was unexpectedly postponed due to conditions. But the weather maps in the region were normal. Transference happens in science. But when transference coincides with the very hour when geometry sparks in amateurs, you get the feeling that someone is afraid not of making a mistake, but of seeing. Paranoia doesn't start with fantasies. It starts with statistics of coincidences that line up too neatly. Ilya put it this way: they don't argue with us. They just bypass the hour. They don't prohibit. They don't refute. They don't explain. They simply make it seem like the critical window doesn't exist. And here's where the story takes a turn. Because while major observatories bypass the hour, there's only one source left that doesn't skip it out of habit: orbital systems. Those that watch not when it's convenient, but when there's a passage. Those with a strict schedule. Those for whom any safe mode event is an event. There's one problem with this hour that doesn't bother amateurs and hardly concerns the press. Orbital telescopes don't pick their moment. They fly by, and if the target is in the window, it's in the window. Period. That's why all conversations suddenly boil down to one acronym, usually spoken calmly: safe mode. The mode where machines go when they're feeling unwell, and where they almost never go perfectly on time. Inside that morning, everything seemed too clean. No panic in the public channels, no unusual headlines, just a short line in the service feed, automatically switching to protective mode. Not for a day, not for while we figure it out, just for the window where the object should have been most visible. So precisely, in fact, that it looks more like a schedule than a glitch. Ilya didn't see this from the news. He'd been sent a screenshot from a private discussion where people don't play riddles. It contained two words that make your hands go cold: coincided again. Because again meant it wasn't the first time. It's just that before, the coincidences were too small to add up to a story. But now, history itself had come knocking. At that moment, Mario did what any sensible person does when the air around him begins to smell like a myth. He asked for numbers, not estimates, not emotions. Telemetry. A couple of minutes later, the file arrived. It was dry, unsigned, and without explanation. Inside were snippets of parameters that aren't usually shared in chats: power, orientation, sensor errors, timestamps. And there was a pattern. Not strange, not unusual. Repetition. As if the machine was trying to execute the same command in a loop, over and over again at the same interval. This isn't what a breakdown looks like. This is what a conflict looks like. When one part of the system says do it, and the other says don't. And they argue not with words, but with attempts. Ilya looked at these intervals and caught himself with an unpleasant thought. The interval coincided with the very step they had already discussed regarding the jets: the multiple changes in activity. Not perfect, but close enough that the brain began connecting the dots without permission. And the worst part was, those dots connected too logically. If it's just a hardware failure, why does it have a rhythm? Why doesn't it just fall apart chaotically, like hardware usually does? Why does it tick like a metronome? At the same hour, rumor has it, an emergency call was called within NASA. Such calls are not publicized, but they are easily recognized by their signatures: sudden busy slots, delays, silence on channels that are usually noisy. The public response is the same: routine safety procedure, standard behavior under uncertainty, no impact on the scientific program. But something else is happening behind the scenes. Because behind the scenes, someone needs to answer a question that can't even be posed out loud. Why did the glitch happen so timely? Ilya once again hit the same wall as with the amateur footage. Officially, no one disputes it. No one says, "You're lying." No one tries to refute it. Instead, details begin to disappear. Timestamps are replaced by ranges. The wording becomes vague. During the observation period instead of at 0602. And this isn't proof of a conspiracy. It's proof of fear. Because fear in such systems always manifests itself in the same way: to strip the accuracy from the text so that it won't be presented back. Against this backdrop, one small fact stood out too loudly. There was a moment in the telemetry where the orientation load jerked, as if someone were trying to turn the spacecraft without asking its consent. This doesn't mean someone remotely turned on the steering wheel. It means the orientation system sensed the external influence and began compensating as best it could, and then went into defense mode. A reason too simple to be beautiful and too terrible to be acceptable. External influence on precise aiming at the moment of observing an object. And if this is true, then the next question arises, worse than the previous one. What exactly was this influence? A particle, a field, interference, or something that behaves like interference but chooses its time? Mario, who had kept a cool head until then, wrote one sentence and didn't write again for 10 minutes. If I wanted to hide an hour, I'd hide it like this. Ilya understood what he meant. There was no need to disrupt the mission. There was no need to shut down the telescope for a week. It was enough to put it into safe mode for that very period of time so that no one would be able to retake the images later, because then the object will be gone. Then the geometry will change. Then the bracket won't fit in the right angle. Then it will be possible to say that amateurs have caught an artifact. And then they did the final check, which made Ilya's ribs ache. They took the safe mode moments and superimposed them on the object's activity graph, based on independent sources. What emerged wasn't a line or proof, it was a feeling. Every time the most informative frame was expected, the system seemed to close its eyes a second too early. Not always, not ideally, but often enough that it stops being a nuisance, and rare enough that it doesn't feel like an outright ban. The most dangerous scenario always operates on the edge, so that intelligent people can debate, not shout, so that statistics don't become a death sentence, but remain a suspicion. At the end of that day, Ilya received a short message from a man who had been silent for a week. The military has a reflection. Don't say it openly. The second line was even shorter. They see structure, not dust. And then silence, as if the author had thrown away the phone. Ilya sat, stared at the screen, and realized something simple. The amateurs had caught the edge. Orbit had closed its eyes. And somewhere nearby, there were radars that weren't required to believe in comets. And if the radars really do see something wrong, then the next step won't be scientific. It will be administrative. Windows will be officially closed, under any pretext. That evening, the line between observing and recording disappeared. Only people remained who clung to the numbers because there was too much air in the words. The message about the radars looked like paranoid spam until Ilya saw who sent it. This person wasn't spreading rumors. He was suppressing them. And if they wrote, "There's a reflection," then there was one. In civilian astronomy, you work with light, with photons, with sensor noise, with the atmosphere, with calibration. In radar, you work with the response. You fire a pulse and wait for the world to echo back. A comet is usually nearly empty on radar. It scatters dust, it scatters gas, and the reflection is jagged, weak, and dancing. It's not a dot. It's more of a hint, easily dismissed as interference. And here, according to someone who saw the graphs, the response was consistent, repeatable, as if there was geometry there, as if the impulse was returning from something that could be a surface. The most distressing thing about stories like these isn't that someone is hiding something. The most distressing thing is that after such words, people start behaving in the same way. They stop writing unnecessary things. Scientific chats become dry. Instead of "look at this," it becomes "later." Instead of "here's the file," it becomes "I can't." And you realize it's not because they're lazy, but because they were asked. Ilya didn't believe in one thing, that everyone could be silenced at once. But there's no need to shut everyone down. It's enough to create a risk in a few key places, and then the others will fall silent themselves. First, the time windows disappeared. Previously, observation schedules were almost a public thing, at least in the form of hints. Now they have become official. Then preprints started getting delayed. Technically, it's not a ban. It's a review, agreeing on wording, refining the methodology. It all sounds reasonable until you realize one thing. If the data is truly routine, no one will pressure you to release it quickly. No one will touch the text. They'd simply release it and move on. Pressure only arises when there's fear of a reaction. That night, Ilya saw for the first time what fear looks like in people accustomed to not being afraid. Not panic, not hysteria, just a careful crossing out of the corners. They discussed the property as one might discuss a problematic contract. No estimates, no conclusions, only observations. With reference to uncertainty, Ilya read this and understood. If in a scientific text one has to apologize in advance for every comma, then the comma itself is already more dangerous than the data. On the second screen, he had a chart of amateur observations. 2 different points in the world, 2 different instruments in the same strange moment. A brief dip in brightness, followed by a rise again. It looked like an eclipse, but an eclipse of a comet by someone or something that shouldn't be there would be a whole different story. One that would leave no one sleeping. And then he did what should have been done long ago. He began to assemble a picture not from snapshots, but from schedules and silence. When there's silence, that's also data. On the same day, 3 major platforms postponed their publications about 3A TLAS. They didn't cancel them. They didn't delete them. They simply moved them, and each time for the same amount of time, as if they'd been given a common template. Several Astro forums also suddenly stopped loading FITS files. It's a coincidence if it's just one. It's a system issue if it happens in different places without a common cause. Ilya couldn't prove it, but he saw how small doors, usually open, began to close simultaneously around the world, and it felt like a stop command. Against this backdrop, Hubble's safe mode ceased to be a mere oddity. It became the first major click in the lock. After that, they began to shut down the rest, because it became clear the hour was dangerous. And then a new sound appeared, not in chat or in emails. In news feeds, where such topics usually appear at the bottom, the same wording suddenly appeared. The object is safe. No threats. It is scientifically interesting. The words were correct, but their intonation was defensive, like that of a person who is making excuses before asking a question. Ilya realized that what scared him most in this story wasn't the object itself. It was the consistency of the reaction. Consistency always means someone sees more. A couple of hours later, the same source sent a third message, shorter than the previous ones, because longer ones are more dangerous. The signature is holding. It's not a cloud. There's a boundary. Edge. A word beloved by engineers. Edge means that the reflection behaves as if the object had an edge, a rib, a surface with constant properties. A comet doesn't have to have a facet. Ice and dust create chaos, but a facet creates a product. Even if that product is covered in debris, its core reveals itself not by beauty, but by stability. At that moment, Ilya understood why everyone was so nervous. Because civilian optics can argue endlessly, but radar is about the form of the response. There's less room for poetry there. If the military truly sees structure, then it's not science that begins. It's protocol, and protocol doesn't like noise, especially public noise. Ilya imagined a simple scenario. Somewhere at the base, there's an operator. He doesn't know what 3ATLAS is. He doesn't care about legends. He sees that the reflection is not as usual, and he reports it. The report goes up, they don't understand it, but they do understand one thing. It shouldn't be publicly available until it's clear what it is. So they restrict access just in case. That just in case always destroys trust. Because if you cut off access, you admit there's a reason, even if the reason is trivial. The next day, the windows really did start closing. Not directly, not with orders to not look. It was just that priorities suddenly shifted so much that looking became difficult. Sometimes it was scheduled work, sometimes calibration, sometimes weather conditions. Even though the skies were clear in that region, you can't argue with the weather. That's the beauty of explanation. Ilya almost believed they were just shaking after safe mode when the worst happened. A comment he shouldn't have written popped up in one radio amateur's morning log. Caught a reflection at a frequency that's usually empty. Looks like a response from a rotating object. He deleted it an hour later. But the internet has a way of preserving what people manage to see. This line was like a spark in a dry forest. Because if the reflection is being picked up by more than just military radar, then it's not secret equipment. It's physics. And then began what always happens when information gets through. Leaks, screenshots, and retellings appeared, and along with them came the garbage. But there was a grain of truth in the garbage. Several independent people, unknown to each other, described the same thing. The answer looks like a structure, and it repeats itself over a period. Period again. Rotation, metronome, rhythm, 3 different channels, 3 different sources, and the same motif. As if the object isn't just flying, but working. Ilya realized they'd reached a point where they could no longer cling to the beautiful story. Now they had to choose which was more frightening, admitting that nature had created the impossible, or admitting that someone had made it possible. Because if it's artificial, it doesn't have to be hostile, but it does have to be intentional. And intention, near Earth, always sounds like a question that can't be put off. That night, Ilya received a final message from the same source. It was written as if someone had typed it with trembling fingers. The windows will be closed tomorrow. Too late to argue. And one more line, very short. Don't look at the pictures. Look at the pauses. Pauses have become the most important thing. A pause in data. A pause in publications. A pause in explanations. And the most terrifying pause, a pause in observations precisely when the subject is doing the strangest thing. Because during these hours, according to amateur logs, the jets began to form a pattern again. Not chaos, but a sweep. As if the object were changing the direction of its emissions at a constant rate. Ilya looked at these curves and thought that scanning was no longer a metaphor. If an object has structure and if it maintains a rhythm, then scanning becomes a technique. And here a fork in the road appears, one that makes you shudder. Either he's scanning the space around him, or he's scanning us. And then all these random shutdowns look different. The next morning, it was clear that tomorrow had already arrived. There was no grand announcement, no press release, not even anger. There was silence, in which the familiar observation windows suddenly disappeared, as if someone had quietly removed the ladders while everyone was looking up. The first sign was a small detail that usually goes unnoticed. On the schedule page, one block changed its status to maintenance, then a second, then a third. Ilya had seen this happen 100 times, but never in different places, on the same day, with the same wording. Where they used to write weather or low priority, they now wrote calibration. Calibration is the perfect word. It's impossible to argue with. impossible to refute, and it sounds scientific enough to be unquestionable to those outside the system. Ilya opened the chat and saw that people had started whispering, even in text messages. Not because someone was listening to every word, but because that's what happens when you realize that a different logic has emerged beyond science, and it has its own rules. Inside NASA, the silence was different. They didn't write, "I can't." They simply stopped responding quickly. Yesterday, someone would respond in a minute. Today, in 3 hours. Tomorrow, never again. This isn't ignoring someone. It's protocol that gently closes the door on contacts without a fight. Ilya caught himself thinking something strange. It doesn't matter what they see. What matters is that they've decided to limit the speed of spread. When they limit the speed, it's because they're afraid someone will see too much too soon. The second monitor contained amateur charts, and they looked more brazen than the official ones. Because an amateur doesn't have to approve anything. They might make mistakes, they might not understand, but they can record the moment as it is. And the moment was very specific. The stream changed direction with a uniform step. It didn't twitch, didn't waver, didn't flutter. It simply moved, as if someone were turning it across a grid, marking the squares. Ilya didn't like the word scanning. It sounded cinematic, but when you see something repeating the same pattern, you have no other vocabulary. Either it's randomness that suddenly becomes disciplined, or it's discipline masquerading as randomness. I was tempted to say, it's just the core spinning. Rotation always saves the day. Rotation can explain almost anything until you're shown synchronicity with another data channel, where rotation is no longer about light, but about the response. The reflection period surfaced precisely on this day, first as a rumor, then as a number written identically by two people, unaware of each other, one on a forum, the other in a private message. Both claimed the same thing. The response was repeating itself, as if the object were marking with an impulse. If this is true, then the image has changed. Then the jets aren't just beautiful tails. Then the jets are an orientation tool, and the reflection is the trace of a structure that rotates and returns a signal precisely at those positions where it has the correct angle. The most vile thing about these conclusions wasn't even the artificiality. The most vile thing was the word behavior. A stone doesn't have behavior. A process has dynamics. Behavior appears where there is a choice of trajectory within constraints. Ilya looked at the curves and realized the closing of the observation windows was not a coincidence. It occurred just before the pattern became obvious even to those who didn't want to see it. Normally, the scientific world behaves the other way around. When something odd appears, the windows are widened, more telescopes are added, and the ranges are crossed. Here, the windows were slammed shut. It was as if someone had pulled the curtain just at the moment when something unnecessary could have been said out loud. Then came the second wave, quieter and more vicious. Small, independent streams of data began to disappear. Not all at once, not drastically, but simply as if the channels were tired. One amateur's server with raw files stopped working. Another's disk suddenly crashed. A third's account was blocked for violating the rules, even though he was posting regular astrometry. Each story is funny on its own. Together, it's not funny anymore. For the first time, Ilya felt they weren't being convinced or argued with. They were simply being diluted. There was no need to destroy the data. It was enough to make people stop trusting it and stop keeping up. Against this backdrop, official announcements became even smoother. Too smooth, like polished stone. No signs of threat. Normal cometary activity. Interesting object. Words that seem reassuring, but in fact close the matter. Ilya knew this style. It's the way they write when they want you to stop asking questions, not when they want you to understand. Understanding requires detail. Reassurance requires ritual. That same evening, an event occurred that no one in normal astronomy would have considered terrifying. Several large instruments simultaneously failed to confirm the details of the structure. Not fail to see, but precisely failed to confirm. The phrase sounded like an excuse, as if they were explaining in advance why the picture everyone was waiting for wouldn't happen. Ilya realized he wasn't waiting for a photo. He was waiting for their logical error, because lying is hard, but hiding it is even harder. You start making slips of the tongue. You start changing your words. You start using the same wording in different places because it was sent out from above as a safe template. At the same time, amateurs, on the contrary, acquired something that observatories lacked. Not because they had better technology, but because they observed for longer periods and without pauses. Two people from different points in the world recorded the same strange dip in brightness at the same interval. Their instruments were different, the sky was different, and the dip coincided so closely in time that random weather no longer applied. It wasn't just a dip. Afterward, the tail seemed to reconfigure. It was as if the object momentarily switched off one configuration and switched on another. And that's when the jet pattern became even more even. Ilya realized they weren't seeing flashes. They were seeing modes. Modes is a technical term, not an astronomical one. An engine, a radar, or a communication system can have a mode. A mode occurs when a system switches logically. He tried to come up with the safest explanation to keep from going crazy. Maybe it was a rare form of outgassing, maybe rotation plus geometry, maybe resonance with the solar wind. But every maybe came down to repeatability. Repetition kills comforting hypotheses. Randomness can repeat itself twice. But when it repeats in form, not in outcome, you start thinking about a generator. And then the radar surfaced again. That same steady response that shouldn't exist. That same evening, a new detail came through the chain. The response amplitude was changing in sync with the jet's pitch. It was like a mechanical pendulum. It was as if the object had a key position where it shines toward Earth, not only with photons, but also with its geometry. If that's true, then jets aren't a fountain of beauty. Instead, jets are a way to rotate the body so that the desired edge is always at the correct angle. Ilya suddenly realized why history had become so tense right now. Because this was no longer watching a comet. This was watching management. And they won't leave control near Earth open until they decide what to call it. Because a name creates a reaction, and a reaction is politics. And that's why science has suddenly become cautious. That night, a message arrived from another person Ilya knew from occasional discussions. He wrote little but accurately. We've had access to raw data blocked for 24 hours. The reason hasn't been explained. A day in such windows feels like an eternity. A day means they're trying to get through this crucial period until the noise dies down. A day means someone up there decided it's best for this moment to pass without prying eyes. Ilya opened a map of the object's position and realized that the key segment wasn't just some fancy astronomical phrase. It was real geometry. It was the moment when the object passed through in such a way that it could be seen best from certain latitudes. It was at these very latitudes that the calibration began. This coincidence was too convenient. Ilya felt angry because it looked like the work of man, not the whim of heaven. But the anger quickly passed, replaced by a different feeling, the understanding that they were no longer observers. They were an audience, shown only what they deemed safe. But the most terrifying thing was that the amateur data revealed something else. After each step of the jet, a small repeating mark appeared in the spectrum, as if the composition of the ejecta was changing cyclically. If the composition changes cyclically, it means there are more than just ice pockets inside. It means there's a workflow. And a workflow is a program, even if it's a primitive one. Ilya couldn't prove the program, but he saw the world begin to close around it. And that was almost proof, because the world rarely closes around a natural coincidence. By the next morning, the pauses had become a central fact. A pause on Hubble, a pause in schedules, a pause in preprints, a pause in raw data. And amid these pauses, the jet pattern remained steady, like a metronome. Ilya realized there would be a dilemma. Either one of the major players would lose it and try to explain, or someone would try to keep quiet until the target left. But there's a third possibility, one everyone was afraid to consider, that the object itself would take a step that would be impossible to coordinate and impossible to close with any calibration. Because if it's a mode, then the mode has a subsequent stage. And if it's a scan, then the scan usually ends when the target is recognized. The brightness dip didn't just happen at some point. It happened as if it had a precise minute. Two independent observers sent the same message without agreeing. Turned off. Ilya reread the messages 5 times because his brain clung to the hope that it was a processing error. One was shooting with an amateur reflector in dry, cold air. The other on the other side of the planet, where the night was warm and humid. Different conditions, different cameras, different lenses. And the failure coincided not in sensation, but in timing, as if they had both been given the same scenario. The most disturbing thing wasn't even the drop in brightness. After the dip, the tail structure in the frames changed stepwise. It didn't spread, didn't float, didn't fluff up. It seemed to shift emphasis, as if the jet's vector had switched to a different channel and begun drawing the next line of the pattern. Ilya discovered a third source, the one that usually lies and makes noise. There was a trace there too. Less certainty, but the same rhythm. 3 coincidences no longer seemed like chance. 3 coincidences were starting to look like a response to someone watching him too closely. He caught himself comparing it to a simple technical trick. When you want to understand who's listening, you change the carrier frequency and see who twitches. You don't need to understand someone's nature to see a reaction. You just need to register that there is a reaction at all. Almost immediately after the dip, strange things began to happen elsewhere. Not in the tail, not in the light, but in the data noise. The background, which should have been random, briefly became collected. It was as if someone had briefly tightened the scatter to squeeze in a narrow, pure signal. Ilya couldn't publicly call it a signal. Any word would turn into an accusation and provoke a defensive reaction. So he wrote something else. You don't have the right atmosphere. Check if there's something similar at the third point, and sent it to the person who had remained silent for almost a day. The answer came unexpectedly quickly, and it was worse than any silence. Yes, we see it. We were told not to publish it. No emotion, just a dry statement, as if someone was writing in the dark, economizing on words. Ilya realized that inside, where they usually argue, the first decision had already been made. Not to explain, not to refute, not to verify, but to slow down. First they slow down, then they choose the wording. The wording always comes after the facts, because the wording controls people. An hour later, another coincidence surfaced online. Meteorological maps for several regions showed sharp deviations, but not the kind that people like to discuss in the news. They looked like a jagged edge in the background, like a fast-moving wave, and it too moved in steps, as if someone were turning a knob. Ilya didn't want to connect the earthly with the heavenly. It always looks cheap, even if it's true. But there was no time for precision, because the coincidences were becoming too numerous, and they all fit into the same time frame. Inside NASA at that moment, something was happening that never gets out into the open. Not panic, but a gathering of people who don't usually sit in the same room. Astronomers, communications engineers, orientation specialists, those who watch the telemetry the way a surgeon watches a monitor. An emergency meeting was quickly called, but informally. Not for everyone, but for those who had already seen it. It's a subtle difference that makes all the difference. When you call everyone, it's science. When you call only those who have already seen it, it's damage control. In this call, according to one person, there was a rule that wasn't spoken out loud. No words that couldn't be taken back. Not object but body. Not control but stabilization. Not response but correlation. Ilya read the retelling and felt his tongue trying to hold a lid on the pot. But the lid shook because the numbers wouldn't obey the words. If the same pattern of brightness failure repeated itself, his tongue would begin to break before his eyes. A few hours later, the failure occurred again. Not identical, but recognizable. First, a brief loss of brightness, then a tail restructuring, then the same collected noise that sounded like an insertion. And all of this coincided with several large instruments again going silent, as if they had been yanked from their sockets by a soft hand. For the first time, Ilya said out loud what he'd been holding inside. They closed the windows just for the moment of switching. He didn't add who they were, because at that moment, they were no longer just people. The most shocking realization came from a simple detail. The switch seemed to occur through observation, not from the sun, not from geometry, not from temperature, but from the fact that he was being watched with a dense, networked gaze from many points at once. Ilya understood how damaging this sounded to his reputation, but he wasn't talking about mysticism. He was talking about the simple idea of feedback. If an object has sensors and modes, it can distinguish between silence and attention. This doesn't require intelligence. Automation is sufficient. That's why synchronicity between different observation points became key. Having 10 telescopes observing simultaneously isn't just more data. It's a different mode of influence on a system that can detect synchronous patterns around itself. That night, the amateurs accidentally did something the officials tried to avoid. They watched too closely. They didn't realize they were posing a question to the subject with their schedule. And when the subject responded, they had no protocol for how to deal with it. The next morning, one of the amateurs posted a short fragment, just a few seconds, without explanation. He simply showed a breakdown, then perestroika. 40 minutes later, the post disappeared. Not because of the author, because of the platform. The reason was ridiculous and offensive. Disinformation. Ilya sat and stared at the empty space where the video had been, and he realized it wasn't just about space anymore. It was about controlling the reaction to space. Because the object wouldn't ask the platform for permission, but the platform would try to ask the object for permission if it started to feel safer that way. That same day, the radar story resurfaced in closed channels, not as a rumor this time, but as a short table, a consistent reflection, repeatability, a phase shift that matched the jet's pitch. It was that moment when two different worlds overlapped perfectly. If the reflection changes phase in time with the jet, then the jet isn't a side effect. This means the jet is part of a maneuver that changes the orientation or geometry of the visible structure. Ilya couldn't conceive of a natural system that does this so cleanly and so timely. Then the most terrifying thing emerged, because it sounded so simple. He does this to see us, not to fly away, not to outlive the sun, to see. Because scanning without a purpose is meaningless, and a pattern without an addressee turns into noise. Ilya didn't know what exactly the object sees, but he began to understand that the object changes modes when it receives maximum information. And it receives maximum information when the entire planet is watching it, simultaneously at the same hour. Inside NASA, it's been recounted, a chilling, almost childish dilemma arose at that moment. If this is feedback, then mass observation amplifies the response. But if the response could be more than just a tail remodeling, what would happen if the entire world deliberately watched? No one wanted to say it out loud, because the next question was even worse. What if he's already gotten used to us watching and starts making his next move even when our back is turned? By evening, word arrived that a unified explanation was being prepared for scientific institutes to iron out the discrepancies. A unified explanation always means that the real picture doesn't fit into a single text, and they're trying to force it in. Ilya realized they were entering a phase where science would become secondary. First, there would be a manipulated version of events, then careful publication, then belated recognition, if recognition were possible at all. But the facility operated according to its own schedule, and this schedule was more terrifying than any bureaucracy. Because on the night before the third failure, a new element appeared in the data. Not an amplification of the old one, not noise. A new marker, as if someone had added a second layer on top of the scan. It was like the system first scans the space and then begins to check the observer's reaction. Not just where you are, but how you look. And if this is true, then the next stage will no longer be about the tail, but about us.